For Julian Vane, the 34-year-old CFO of Vane Logistics, the cold was merely a backdrop seen through the triple-paned, floor-to-ceiling windows of his penthouse office. Julian was a man of precision. His silk tie was knotted in a perfect Windsor. His desk was a barren landscape of brushed aluminum. And his heart, though he wouldn't admit it, was as cold as the January air outside. Today was the pinnacle of his career. At 4 p.m., he was scheduled to sign a merger agreement with Sterling Holloway, a deal that would solidify his legacy and make him one of the youngest billionaires in the Midwest. "Sir, the car is downstairs," his assistant Marcus said over the intercom. Julian grabbed his charcoal overcoat. He didn't look at the photos on his wall. He didn't have any. No wife, no children, only a collection of awards for fiscal excellence. As he stepped out of the lobby of the Vane building, the reality of the city hit him. The smell of exhaust, the roar of the L train overhead, and the stark contrast of wealth and poverty. Just 10 feet from his waiting black SUV sat a woman. She was huddled in a doorway, wrapped in a threadbare wool blanket that might have been blue once, but was now the color of wet pavement. Beside her was a small boy, no more than 5, his face tucked into her side for warmth. Julian usually looked past people like this. To him, they were structural inefficiencies of a city he helped run. But as he reached for the car door, the woman looked up. Her eyes weren't dull or defeated. They were a piercing, haunting green. "Mr. Vane," she whispered. Her voice was thin, raspy from the cold, but it carried an authority that stopped him mid-motion. "How do you know my name?" Julian asked, his hand hovering over the door handle. "I know the man who is about to lose his soul," she said, shivering. "You're going to the signing. You're going to sign the Sterling deal." Julian felt a prickle of unease. "It's public knowledge. Now, if you'll excuse me, I'm in a hurry." The woman stood up, her legs wobbling. She took a step toward him, and the security guard moved to intervene, but Julian held up a hand. There was something about her, a grace that didn't belong in a doorway. "Don't sign that paper, Julian," she whispered, leaning close enough that he could smell the faint scent of old lavender amidst the city grime. "If you do, the silence in your house will never go away. They aren't buying your company. They are buying your silence." "Who are you?" Julian demanded. "A mother who sees what's coming," she said. "Please, for the sake of the people you're about to erase." Julian scoffed, masking a sudden, inexplicable tremor in his hands. "I have a business to run. Marcus, give her $50. He climbed into the car, the heavy door thudding shut, sealing out the cold. But as the SUV pulled away, he looked back. The woman wasn't looking at the money in Marcus's hand. She was looking directly at Julian through the tinted glass, her lips moving in a silent prayer. The boardroom of Sterling Holloway was located on the 88th floor of the Willis Tower. It was a room designed to make men feel like gods. Arthur Sterling, a man with white hair and a smile like a shark, sat at the head of the mahogany table. "Julian, the man of the hour," Arthur boomed. "The pens are ready. The champagne is on ice. We've been waiting for this for 3 years." Julian sat down, laying his leather portfolio on the table. Usually his mind was a calculator, running numbers and projections. But now, all he could hear was the woman's whisper. "Don't sign that." "Something wrong, Julian?" Arthur asked, his eyes narrowing. "You look like you've seen a ghost." "I'm fine, Arthur. Just the cold," Julian replied. He opened the contract. It was 600 pages of legal jargon. He knew it by heart, or he thought he did. As his eyes scanned the liability and environmental impact section, a section he had personally vetted, he saw a small, handwritten note in the margin of the master copy. It was a series of coordinates and a date from 5 years ago. It shouldn't have been there. It looked like a smudge, but to a man of Julian's detail, it was a red flag. "Is there an issue with the indemnification clause?" Arthur's lawyer asked smoothly. "I'm just doing a final check," Julian said. He thought about the woman. How could she have known? She was a transient, a resident of the nearby shelter. Yet her warning felt like a physical weight on his chest. "Let's get to it," Arthur pressed, pushing a gold fountain pen across the table. "Once this is signed, Vane Logistics becomes part of a global empire. You'll be the youngest CFO in the history of the S&P 100. Julian picked up the pen. It was heavy, cold. He looked at the signature line. Below it was the logo of Sterling Holloway. He thought about the thousands of employees who worked for him. He thought about the erasing the woman mentioned. Suddenly, Julian's phone buzzed in his pocket. A news alert. It was a localized report about a sudden chemical leak in a small town in Ohio, a town where Sterling Holloway had a major warehouse. The date of the initial report matched the coordinates he just saw in the margin. His heart hammered against his ribs. The deal wasn't a merger, it was a bailout. Sterling was dumping their environmental litigation onto Vane's clean balance sheet. Julian? Arthur's voice was no longer friendly. It was a command. Julian looked at the pen, then at the door. He thought of the woman in the cold. She wasn't a ghost, she was a mirror. "I'm not signing," Julian said, his voice steady. The room went silent. You could hear the hum of the HVAC system. Arthur Sterling's face turned a deep, bruised purple. "What did you just say?" "The deal is off, Arthur. We're done here." Julian walked out of the Willis Tower, ignoring the screams of Arthur Sterling and the panicked calls from his own board of directors. His phone was exploding with notifications. Stock prices were already reacting to the rumor of the deal collapsing. He didn't care. He drove back to the Vane building, but the doorway was empty. The woman and the boy were gone. Only a small discarded toy car, a cheap plastic thing, remained on the frozen concrete. Julian picked it up. He felt a desperate need to find her. He needed to know how she knew. Was it a setup? Was she a corporate spy? Or was she something else? He spent the next 4 hours driving through the slush-filled streets of the South Side, checking every shelter and soup kitchen. He finally pulled up to St. Jude's Refuge, a crumbling brick building that smelled of floor wax and weary souls. "I'm looking for a woman," Julian told the volunteer at the desk, a tired-looking grandmother named Martha. "Green eyes, has a young son. She was outside my building today." Martha sighed. "That sounds like Elena, but she doesn't like visitors, especially men in suits. Usually means trouble." "I'm not trouble," Julian said, though he wasn't sure if that was true. "She helped me. I just want to understand why." Martha studied him for a long moment. "She's in the basement ward. Her son Leo has a fever. The heaters are broken again, and the boy is fragile." Julian followed her down the stairs. The basement was lined with cots. It was loud with the sound of coughing and crying. In the far corner, he saw the green-eyed woman. She was sitting on the floor, holding her son against her chest, humming a low, haunting melody. She looked up as Julian approached. She didn't look surprised. "You didn't sign?" she said. It wasn't a question. "How did you know?" Julian asked, kneeling on the cold floor, heedless of his $4,000 suit. "I used to be a paralegal at Sterling Holloway," Elena said, her voice trembling. 6 years ago, I found the files on the Ohio leaks. I tried to whistleblow. They didn't just fire me, Julian. They erased me, blacklisted me from every firm in the country. They sued me into bankruptcy. My husband left when the money ran out. I ended up here." Julian felt a wave of nausea. He had almost joined hands with the people who had destroyed this woman's life. "Why tell me?" he asked. "Because I watched your interviews," Elena said, stroking her son's hair. "You're cold, Mr. Vane. But you aren't cruel. There's a difference. Cruel men enjoy the pain. Cold men just don't notice it. I thought if I could make you notice, maybe you'd stop them." The boy, Leo, let out a jagged, rattling cough. Julian reached out and touched the boy's forehead. He was burning up. "He needs a hospital," Julian said. "They won't take us without insurance," Elena whispered. "Not for the kind of care he needs. He has chronic respiratory issues from the mold in the first shelter we stayed at." Julian stood up, his eyes flashing with a new kind of fire. Not the fire of a deal-maker, but the fire of a protector. "Pack your things," Julian said. "You're leaving this place." Julian didn't take them to a public hospital. He called his private physician and had him meet them at his own home, the silent, echoing penthouse. As Elena walked through the doors of the ultra-modern apartment, she looked like a stray cat in a palace. She held Leo tightly, her eyes darting to the expensive art on the walls. "Sit," Julian said, gesturing to the oversized velvet sofa. Dr. Eris will be here in 10 minutes. Why are you doing this? Elena asked. The board will fire you for walking away today. You should be at your office, saving your career. My career was built on a lie that I was doing something important, Julian said, pouring her a glass of water. I was just moving numbers around. This is the first real thing I've done in a decade. The doctor arrived and treated Leo for a severe bronchial infection. He administered an IV for dehydration and gave him strong antibiotics. He'll be fine, the doctor whispered to Julian in the hallway. But he can't go back to the street. Another night in that cold would have turned into pneumonia. Julian nodded. He went back into the living room. Leo was asleep on the sofa, draped in a cashmere throw. Elena was standing by the window looking out at the city lights. I have a guest suite, Julian said. Stay here, both of you. Julian, you don't know me, she said. I know what Sterling did to you, and I know I'm going to make them pay for it, he replied. The next morning, the unthinkable happened. The news broke. Julian Vane, CFO of Vane Logistics, files massive whistleblower lawsuit against Sterling Holloway. But that wasn't the unthinkable part. The unthinkable part was that Julian Vane had resigned his position, liquidated his personal stock, worth hundreds of millions, and announced the creation of the Elena Foundation, a housing and legal defense fund for families displaced by corporate negligence. He went from being the golden boy of Wall Street to the most hated man in corporate America overnight. His peers called him insane. His board called him a traitor. He didn't care. For the first time, his home wasn't silent. There was the sound of a child breathing peacefully in the next room, and the smell of actual coffee in the kitchen. The honeymoon period of Julian's awakening lasted exactly 48 hours. By the third day, the Empire struck back. Arthur Sterling didn't just want Julian defeated. He wanted him destroyed. Julian's bank accounts were frozen pending an investigation into insider trading. The locks on his office were changed. Even his penthouse, which was technically owned by a holding company tied to the firm, was served with an eviction notice. Julian sat at his kitchen table, staring at the legal documents. They're coming for everything, aren't they? Elena asked, entering the room. She was wearing a sweater Julian had bought for her, simple, gray, but it made her look human again. They're trying, Julian said, but they're playing the old game. They think money is the only leverage. Isn't it? Julian looked at her. I used to think so. But I've spent my whole life making sure I had enough money so I would never have to be afraid. And yet, I was terrified every single day. Terrified of losing my status. Now that I've lost it, I'm not scared anymore. Leo ran into the room, holding the plastic toy car. Look, Mr. Julian, it zooms. Julian smiled, a genuine, unpracticed smile. It does, Leo. It really does. But the threat was real. That afternoon, a group of men in dark suits arrived at the door. They weren't lawyers. They were private security. Mr. Vane, you have 1 hour to vacate the premises, the lead man said. I have a sick child in here, Julian said, his voice dropping to a dangerous level. Not our problem. Move, or we move you. Julian looked back at Elena. She was pale, her hands shaking. She had been through this before. She knew what it was like to be thrown into the cold. Go to the car, Julian whispered to her. The SUV in the basement. The keys are in the bowl. Julian, what are you going to do? I'm going to show them that a man with nothing to lose is a very dangerous person. The air in the hallway of the Vane building was thick with the scent of floor wax and the cold metallic tang of an impending confrontation. Julian stood his ground, his smartphone held aloft like a shield. On the screen, the viewer counts were ticking upward with dizzying speed, 10K, 50K, 100K. The world was watching the fall of a titan in real time. My name is Julian Vane, he began, his voice echoing off the marble walls. I am the CFO of this company, but as of this moment, I am a man being evicted from his own life. Why? Because I refused to sign a document that would have buried the truth under a mountain of gold. I refused to let Sterling Holloway poison the lungs of children in Ohio and walk away with a clean balance sheet. The lead security guard, a man named Miller whom Julian had exchanged nods with for years, looked pained. Mr. Vane, please. Don't make this harder. We have orders. Orders from men who hide behind desks, Julian countered, never lowering the camera. He turned the lens to Elena, who stood by the elevators, clutching Leo's hand. The boy's eyes were wide, reflecting the sterile overhead lights. This is Elena. 6 years ago, she tried to do the right thing. They took her home, her career, and her dignity. Today they are trying to do the same to me, but the data doesn't lie. With a single tap, Julian executed the dead man's switch he had prepared. A massive encrypted file, containing years of internal memos, soil toxicity reports, and payoff ledgers, was released to every major news outlet and independent journalist in the country. When they finally descended to the street, the scene was chaotic. The quiet dignity of the Chicago Loop had been replaced by a roar. People who had been watching the live stream on their lunch breaks had flocked to the building. There were bicycle messengers, office workers in North Face parkas, and a group of local activists. As Julian emerged with Elena and Leo, the crowd didn't jeer. They parted like the Red Sea, a hush falling over them before a low, rhythmic chant began. The transition to their new life was a jarring descent into reality. Their new apartment was in a faded brick building in Humboldt Park. The elevator was perpetually broken, and the hallway smelled of fried onions and old radiator steam. "It's cozy," Julian said, trying to find a positive spin as he hauled their few suitcases into the living room. The wallpaper was peeling at the corners, and the window looked out onto a gray alleyway. Elena walked to the radiator, which was clanking like a hammer against an anvil. She placed her hand on it and smiled. "It's warm, Julian, and the locks are heavy. You have no idea what a luxury a heavy lock is until you've spent a year sleeping with one eye open." That night, Julian lay on a mattress that dipped in the middle. He expected to feel the crushing weight of his lost status. He expected the silence to be deafening. Instead, he heard the muffled sound of a neighbor's television and the distant siren of a police car. He felt a strange, light sensation in his chest. For the first time in his adult life, he didn't need a chemical sedative to sleep. He wasn't Julian Vane, the architect of global logistics. He was just a man in a small room. And for the first time, that was enough. The Dirksen Federal Courthouse, a somber monolith of glass and black steel in the heart of the Loop, became the epicenter of the American legal world. The case was officially the People versus Sterling Holloway, but in the court of public opinion, and across every social media feed, it was known as the Soul of the City trial. Every morning, the ritual was the same. Arthur Sterling arrived in a fleet of black, armored sedans, looking like a king going to war. He was surrounded by a phalanx of lawyers from the most expensive firms in the country, men and women who wore suits that cost more than Julian's current annual rent. They used every tactic in the book: motions to dismiss, character assassination, and endless paperwork designed to bury the truth under a mountain of legal bureaucracy. "Character assassination is their only move now," Julian told the prosecution team in a cramped, windowless office during the 3rd month. Julian had become their most valuable asset. He spent 14 hours a day teaching the government lawyers how to read the hidden language of corporate accounting. He showed them how Sterling had used shell companies in the Cayman Islands to fund environmental cleanup projects that were nothing more than empty bank accounts used for tax write-offs. The defense's turn to cross-examine Julian was the most anticipated moment of the year. The courtroom was packed. The air was thick with the scent of old wood and nervous sweat. The lead defense attorney, Sarah Vance, a woman with a reputation for breaking witnesses within 10 minutes, paced before the stand. "Mr. Vane, let's be honest with the jury," she said, her voice dripping with a rehearsed, patronizing sweetness. "You were passed over for the CEO position. You were angry. This isn't about environmental justice. This is a bitter man's revenge against a mentor who saw through his ambition." Julian looked at his hands, then up at Sarah. He was calm, a calm that seemed to unnerve her. "I was never passed over, Sarah. Arthur Sterling personally promised me the throne. I didn't leave because I was bitter. I left because I realized the throne was sitting on a graveyard of families who couldn't defend themselves. And we are to believe you threw away a billion-dollar career because a homeless woman whispered to you in the snow?" she sneered, turning toward the jury. "A woman with a documented history of mental distress following her termination?" Julian didn't blink. He looked directly at Elena, who was sitting in the front row, her hands trembling. She wasn't distressed because she was unstable. She was distressed because she was the only human being in a room of 500 people who still had a conscience. I didn't listen to her because I was irrational. I listened to her because she was the only one speaking a language I still recognized as truth. The turning point came when Julian produced the smoking gun. It wasn't a digital file but a physical weathered ledger he had retrieved from an old warehouse archive. It contained Arthur Sterling's own handwriting, authorizing the minimization of toxicity reporting for the Ohio site. The silence in the room when that ledger was displayed was absolute. When the verdict was read, guilty on all counts, with a $4.2 billion settlement, the courtroom erupted into a roar of cheers. But Julian didn't join them. He turned to Elena, who was weeping silently into her hands. He realized then that the money wouldn't bring back her lost years or her health, but it would ensure that no other mother would have to whisper in the cold for justice. The collapse of Sterling Holloway was not just a corporate bankruptcy, it was a structural demolition of an American dynasty. As the federal marshals moved into the glass and chrome offices, the liquidators began the grim task of untangling a web of corruption that spanned decades. Arthur Sterling, the man who once held the keys to the city's commerce, was stripped of his custom-tailored identity. The iconic image that graced the front page of the Chicago Tribune showed him in a standard-issue orange jumpsuit, his hands shackled, framed by the cold, unforgiving orange glow of a Midwestern sunset. For Julian, the victory felt less like a celebration and more like a long-awaited exhale. Standing on the granite steps of the Dirksen courthouse, the cold Chicago wind whipped through his hair, no longer feeling like an adversary but like a cleansing force. He stood shoulder to shoulder with Elena, whose green eyes finally held a spark of light that hadn't been there in years. "Mr. Vane! Over here!" A reporter from a major news network shouted, thrusting a microphone forward. "The White House is reportedly looking for a new ethics czar. Your name is at the top of the list. Are you ready to take your fight to D.C.?" Julian looked down at the slush-covered sidewalk. He saw a discarded coffee cup, a stray glove, and the weary faces of the people passing by. People he used to ignore from the back of a tinted SUV. "I've spent my entire career in the halls of power, making decisions for people I never bothered to meet," Julian said, his voice carrying an unexpected weight. "I'm done with the halls of power. I'm going to spend the rest of my life in the streets. I'm retiring from being Julian Vane, the CFO. I'm looking forward to meeting Julian Vane, the neighbor." But the transition was a battlefield of its own. The unthinkable act of walking away from billions had left him with a strange phantom limb syndrome. For years, every minute of his day was managed by a digital calendar and a team of assistants. Now the silence of a Tuesday afternoon was deafening. He found himself standing in a local Jewel Osco grocery store, the fluorescent lights buzzing overhead. He stood in the cereal aisle for 20 minutes, paralyzed by the sheer variety of options. In his old life, his breakfast was a protein shake delivered by a personal chef. Now the choice between 30 different brands of granola felt like a high-stakes negotiation he wasn't prepared for. "Julian, are you okay?" Elena asked, finding him staring blankly at a box of oats. "I used to move $10 billion across borders before lunch," Julian whispered, his voice cracking with a mix of humor and horror. "And right now, I'm being defeated by a decision between honey nut and cinnamon apple. I don't know how to be a person, Elena." She didn't laugh. She took the box from his hand and leaned in close. "You've spent 15 years being a machine. Machines don't choose. They calculate. You're allowed to just be a man who doesn't know what he wants for breakfast yet." She taught him the low-tech mechanics of survival. She showed him how to wait for the L train without checking his watch every 10 seconds. She taught him how to use the communal washing machines in the basement, where the air was thick with the scent of detergent and the gossip of the neighbors. The most profound shift happened in the kitchen. One rainy Thursday, Julian was attempting to prepare a simple meal. He was hunched over a cutting board, his knuckles white as he gripped a dull knife, trying to dice an onion with the same aggressive precision he used to draft merger agreements. He was sweating, his breath shallow with frustration. "I'm failing at this," he snapped as a piece of onion skittered across the floor. "I'm a failure at the most basic human tasks." Elena stepped behind him. She didn't take the knife away. She placed her warm hands over his, softening his grip. Julian, breathe. You're trying to optimize the onion, you're trying to beat the clock. But there is no clock here. Feel the weight of the steel. Smell the sharp sting of the juice. This is life, Julian. It's not a task to be completed. It's a moment to be lived. He leaned back into her, the tension draining out of his shoulders. In that cramped, dimly lit kitchen, the former CFO of a global empire realized that the greatest luxury wasn't a private jet. It was the permission to be slow. Julian's final act of corporate defiance was the distribution of his remaining wealth. While the courts handled the $2 billion Sterling Holloway settlement for the victims, Julian took his own liquidated millions and poured them into a project that many in the financial world called a suicidal investment. They bought the Grand Windsor, a 1920s-era hotel on the west side. It was a skeletal remains of a building, filled with the echoes of a grander Chicago. For months, Julian traded his Italian leather shoes for steel-toed boots. He didn't just fund the renovation, he lived it. He was there every morning at 6 a.m. drinking lukewarm coffee from a thermos with the plumbers and the electricians. He learned the grit of manual labor, the way your back aches after a day of hanging drywall, the metallic taste of copper as you solder pipes, and the honest satisfaction of seeing a crooked wall become straight through your own effort. The Elena Center wasn't just a shelter, it was a fortress of restoration. The first floor was a vibrant, light-filled community center, where local kids could do homework and young lawyers, recruited by Julian from the city's top firms, worked pro bono to fight illegal evictions. The second floor was a state-of-the-art clinic, but the soul of the building was the top floor. Julian had insisted on restoring the massive floor-to-ceiling arched windows that overlooked the city. He called it the Whispering Project. Julian, the elevator costs alone for the medical ward on the top floor are astronomical, one of the contractors argued. Most places put the recovery rooms in the basement or the back. The people who come here have spent their entire lives looking at the dirt on the sidewalk, Julian replied, his eyes fixed on the Chicago horizon. I want them to wake up and see the sunrise over the lake. I want them to look down on the city that tried to erase them and realize they are still standing above it. They need to remember what it feels like to have a view. Their relationship forged itself in the sawdust and the sweat of the construction site. One evening, after the crews had gone home, Julian and Elena were painting the main lobby. Julian was covered in eggshell white splatters, his hair messy, his hands calloused and rough. He looked nothing like the man who had walked out of the Vane building a year ago. Elena stopped, looking at a letter she had pulled from her pocket. It's from Ohio, Julian, the mother of the little boy with the asthma. She says the new park we built over the old Sterling site is full of kids. Her son played soccer for an hour yesterday without needing his inhaler. She called you a saint. Julian paused, his roller dripping paint onto the dropcloth. He looked at his hands, the hands that used to sign death warrants for small towns with a stroke of a pen. I'm not a saint, Elena. I'm just a man who finally figured out that my signature is only worth something if it helps someone breathe. He walked over to her, pulling her into an embrace that smelled of latex paint and hope. I spent 34 years building things that were meant to be sold. I want to spend the rest of my life building something that is meant to stay. I want to build a legacy that doesn't show up on a balance sheet. Standing in that lobby, surrounded by the shadows of the old hotel and the promise of 1,000 new lives, Julian felt a profound sense of arrival. The corporate world was a fever dream he had finally woken up from. This, the grit, the work, and the woman who had whispered him awake, was the only reality that mattered. 5 years had passed since the day the glass towers of Sterling Holloway trembled. Yet for Julian, every second of those years felt more substantial than the entirety of his previous life. Time in the corporate world was a currency to be spent. Time at the Elena Center was a harvest to be tended. The center had evolved from a local shelter into a national beacon, a modern fairy tale not written by a magic wand, but by the grit of human accountability and the quiet persistence of love. Julian's office was no longer a sterile penthouse. It was a refurbished library on the 3rd floor of the center, filled with the scent of old paper, cedar wood, and the faint, comforting aroma of the community kitchen below. His KPIs, key performance indicators, had undergone a radical transformation. He no longer tracked quarterly dividends or market volatility. Instead, He tracked the number of children in the neighborhood who now had inhalers, the success rate of the legal clinic in blocking predatory evictions, and the number of veterans who had found a bed and a sense of purpose within these brick walls. His personal life had found its own rhythm. 3 years ago, he and Elena had stood in the center's courtyard to say their vows. There was no society guest list, no 500 a plate catering, and no paparazzi. Instead, the wedding feast was a potluck cooked with pride by the residents. A local jazz band, led by a man Julian had helped secure a housing voucher for, played into the night as the sun dipped behind the West Side's industrial skyline. Leo, now 10 years old, standing tall and confident in a suit that Julian had helped him pick out, had given a best man speech that didn't mention money once. He spoke of the man who taught me how to fix a bike and how to tell the truth. There wasn't a dry eye in the neighborhood. On a biting Tuesday in late November, the first real snow of the season began to fall. These weren't just flakes. They were heavy, wet curtains of white that began to hush the roar of Chicago, turning the city into a vast, silent cathedral. Julian was walking back from a grueling session with the city housing department. He wore an old, heavy wool coat, a far cry from the charcoal cashmere of his past, his hands tucked deep into his pockets for warmth. As he cut through the loop, he passed the towering glass monolith of a global investment bank. There, in the amber glow of the lobby lights, he saw a scene that felt like a haunting echo from another life. A young executive, perhaps 25, was pacing the sidewalk in a state of high-voltage agitation. He was the ghost of Julian's past, razor-sharp suit, hair perfectly coiffed despite the wind, and 2 smartphones pressed to his ears. He was barking orders about leveraged buyouts, mitigating the optics, and crushing the competition. His eyes were glazed with the familiar, frantic fever of the hunt. In his blind haste, the young man stepped right over an elderly veteran sitting on a piece of sodden cardboard. The veteran held a small sign that read, "Anything helps." The executive didn't just ignore him. He stumbled over the man's legs, let out a sharp, jagged huff of annoyance, and adjusted his Bluetooth earpiece. "Watch it, Pops! Move your gear! People are trying to work here!" The executive snapped, his eyes never leaving his glowing screen. Julian stopped. The wind whistled between the buildings, but Julian felt a strange internal stillness. He looked at the veteran, a man named Silas, whom Julian recognized from the soup kitchen, whose eyes held a weary, quiet dignity. Then he looked at the young man, who was vibrating with a stress that looked, to Julian's experienced eyes, like a slow-motion suicide. Julian stepped forward. He didn't shout. He simply placed a firm, grounding hand on the executive's shoulder. The young man spun around, his face pale, his eyes bloodshot, and wide with defensive fury. "Look, pal, whatever you're selling, I don't have time. I'm in the middle of a $50 million merger. My entire life is on the line right now." Julian didn't let go. He smiled, a slow, sad, knowing smile. For a fleeting second, the executive saw something in Julian's eyes that made the air in his lungs vanish. It was an authority that didn't come from a bank balance or a title, but from an unshakable, terrifying peace. "I know that feeling," Julian said, his voice a low, steady rumble that seemed to cut through the city noise. "I used to think my life was on the line every day in that building behind you, but you're ignoring your most important consultant. That man you just stepped over?" "What? What about him?" the young man stammered, his bravado flickering. Julian gestured to Silas on the cardboard. "He's seen the end of the road you're running on. If you stop and listen to him for 5 minutes, you might realize that the deal you're about to sign isn't worth the soul you're trading for it. Sometimes the person who has nothing is the only one who can save you from having everything and realizing it's empty." The executive blinked. His phone suddenly felt heavy and silent in his hands. He looked down at Silas, then back at the man in the old wool coat. But Julian was already moving, his silhouette fading into the white veil of the falling snow. He didn't need to see the result. He had simply passed on the seed of truth that a homeless mother had once planted in him. Julian reached the Elena Center and pushed open the heavy, restored oak doors. The transition was instant. The biting cold was replaced by a warmth that smelled of cedar, beeswax, and the savory beef stew being served in the dining hall. In the corner, a resident was playing a soft, melancholic melody on the upright piano. Elena was there, sitting at a circular table with a new family that had arrived that morning. Her green eyes caught Julian's across the room, and she offered a small, tired, beautiful smile that said, "Welcome home." Leo was at a nearby table, his tongue poked out in concentration as he helped a younger boy with long division. Julian sat down on a bench in the hallway and reached into his pocket. His fingers brushed against the smooth, cheap plastic of the toy car he had carried every day for 6 years. It was his compass. He smiled, leaning his head back against the warm brick wall. He wasn't the man who ran the city anymore. He was the man who lived in its heart. And as the heavy doors settled into their frames, sealing out the Chicago winter, Julian realized the CFO was long gone, but the human being had finally, truly, come home.